This is the haunted heart of Windsor Castle, and this is the bedchamber that no guidebook will ever truly describe. Welcome to part 2 of our investigation into the dark history of Britain's oldest occupied royal fortress, because the first part told you what the cannon and the chapel and the Great Fire of 1992 did to the building from the outside. And this part tells you what happened in the rooms above, in the corridors that the visitors never see, in the beds where kings were born and where kings were killed. On the night of 20th of January 1936, in the King's Bedchamber on the north side of the Upper Ward, Lord Dawson of Penn deliberately killed King George V. He injected 3/4 of a grain of morphine and 1 grain of cocaine into the dying king's jugular vein. He did this not to end suffering, because the suffering was already ending of its own accord. He did it so that the announcement of the death would catch the morning edition of The Times rather than the less prestigious evening papers. He wrote this down. He wrote it in his own hand in a private journal that was kept secret for 50 years and was only revealed by his biographer, Francis Watson, in November 1986, half a century after the syringe was emptied. The king's last recorded words, spoken hours earlier when told he would soon be convalescing at Bognor Regis, were reported to the public as a wistful, "How is the Empire?" The reality, as recorded by the attending nurse Catherine Black, was an irritable "Bugger, Bognor." Both sentences were spoken in the same bedchamber. Only one was permitted into history. Stop and consider what that means. The official cause of death was peaceful. The actual cause of death was a deadline. 5 monarchs have died inside the walls of Windsor Castle. 10 monarchs lie in the royal vault beneath St. George's Chapel. The coffin of Henry VIII, when it was finally hauled up the hill to the choir in February 1547, weighed close to 1,300 pounds and required 16 yeomen to lift it. The 1992 fire burned for 15 hours and consumed 115 rooms. The restoration cost £36.5 million. These are the numbers. The numbers are not the story. Today, a visitor at Windsor sees 3 things. They see the great grey curtain wall climbing the chalk ridge above the Thames. They smell the lime wash and the wax polish in the state apartments. They hear the soft cough of a warder and the distant tolling of the curfew tower bell on the hour. They do not see the corridors. They do not smell the laudanum that soaked into the floorboards of the king's apartments between 1810 and 1820. They do not hear what was said in the private chapel at 11:15 on the morning of 20th November 1992, when a curtain brushed a 1,000-watt lamp. On this channel, we tell the story of every great English house through the names the official guidebook forgot. And tonight, we are going to tell you the story of 3 of them. A page named Peter Edgecombe, who held the restraints on a mad king for 10 years. A nurse named Mary Hesketh, who watched a queen die in the small hours of an August morning in 1714, having carried 17 pregnancies and buried every child. And a fire warden named Walter Knight, who in November 1992 walked into a burning chapel to lift the altar plate clear of the flames. If you find these forgotten histories worth a watch, smash the subscribe button. It's the only thing keeping the lamps on at British manors. It begins with a king who needed a private bedchamber, because before him, no English king had ever truly possessed one. The state apartments at Windsor are not the same rooms as the private apartments, and the distinction is older than most people realise. Until the middle of the 14th century, the King of England lived in public. He ate in public. He slept in public, ringed by attendants who slept on pallets at the foot of his bed. There was no door he could close behind him. The change came under Edward III, who between 1357 and 1365 spent more than £50,000 rebuilding Windsor into the largest secular building project undertaken in medieval England. He created for the first time a clear separation between the rooms in which a monarch performed kingship and the rooms in which a monarch slept and bathed and emptied his bowels. The new private lodgings were placed in the north range of the Upper Ward, looking out across the home park towards the Thames. They were entered by a small door beside the sovereign's entrance, a door which still exists and which has not been opened to the public in any reign. From 1475 onwards, Edward IV began the construction of St. George's Chapel in the Lower Ward, the building that would in time receive nearly every body of every monarch who died inside the castle. The geography was set, the private lodgings above, the chapel below, and between them a flight of stone steps worn into a curve by 6 centuries of coffins. In February 1547, the coffin of King Henry VIII was carried out of the Palace of Whitehall on a black draped wagon drawn by 8 horses. It took 3 days to reach Windsor. The cortege halted overnight at Sion Abbey near Brentford, the coffin laid in the chapel under a guard of yeomen. During that night, the lead lining of the coffin, distended by the gases of a vast and decomposing body, split open along its lower seam. Fluid leaked onto the floor of the chapel. By morning, the chapel dogs had found it and were licking the residue from between the flagstones. The yeomen drove them off and resealed the coffin in haste, but the Franciscan friar William Petto, who had years earlier preached before the king and predicted that the dogs would lick the blood of Henry as they had licked the blood of King Ahab in the Book of Kings, was vindicated in absentia. The body reached Windsor the following day. Henry was lowered into the vault beneath the choir of St. George's Chapel and laid beside Jane Seymour, his third queen and the mother of his son, in accordance with his will. The vault was sealed. It would be opened again only twice in the next 4 centuries. Just over 100 years later, on 9th of February 1649, the body of King Charles I, beheaded 10 days earlier on a scaffold outside the banqueting house, was carried up the long walk in a snowstorm. There was no funeral service. The parliamentary commissioners had forbidden the Book of Common Prayer. The bishop attending stood mute as the coffin, bound in lead and engraved only with the words King Charles, 1648, was lowered into the vault that held Henry VIII. Snow drifted onto the black pall. The vault was closed and forgotten. In 1813, the Prince Regent, the future George IV, ordered the vault reopened during alterations to the chapel. His private physician, Sir Henry Halford, was present. Halford lifted the lid of the Charles I coffin. He examined the severed head, which had been sewn back to the trunk for burial, and he confirmed the identification by the pointed beard and the still recognizable features. He also, while no one was looking, removed one of the king's teeth and slipped it into the pocket of his waistcoat. He kept it for the rest of his life. It was returned to the vault by his descendants in 1908. The other relics he took that day, a piece of the 4th cervical vertebra, a lock of hair, have never been recovered. The royal vault was a place that the public would never enter. The private apartments above it were a place the public would never see. And between 1810 and 1820, in those private apartments, the longest and most terrible illness in the history of the English monarchy played itself out behind a single oak door. King George III was 62 years old in November 1810, when his youngest and favourite daughter, Princess Amelia, died at Windsor of tuberculosis and erysipelas. She was 27. In the last week of her life, she had been lifted from her bed in the lower lodge and carried up to the king's apartments so that her father might sit beside her. He sat beside her on the morning of 2nd November 1810, holding her right hand. She was lucid for a final hour. She placed in his palm a mourning ring she had commissioned for him in secret, a ring set with a lock of her own hair under a panel of rock crystal and engraved with the words, "Remember me." The king put it on. He wept. He did not speak. Within a fortnight of her death, he had collapsed into a permanent derangement from which he never recovered. The Regency Act was passed in February 1811. From that month until his death 9 years later, George III was confined to the king's apartments on the north front of the upper ward, in a suite of 3 rooms, whose windows had been fitted with iron bars, and whose doors were locked from the outside. He went blind. The cataracts that had been forming for years closed entirely in 1816. He grew a long white beard because no barber could safely be admitted. He spoke to dead people. He held conversations with Princess Amelia and with his father Frederick, Prince of Wales, who had died in 1751. He was sometimes violent and was at those times restrained in a straitjacket of canvas and leather buckled at the back. The pages of the back stairs, his personal attendants, were instructed never to address him as Your Majesty, because the title agitated him beyond bearing. They were instructed to say only "Sir." His weight fell. By 1819, he weighed under 8 stone. By Christmas of that year, his attendants no longer carried him to the window. He had not seen the sun in months. On the evening of 29th January 1820, in the bedchamber that had been his prison for a decade, King George III died. He was 81 years old. He was the longest-lived British monarch until Queen Victoria surpassed him in 1900 and Elizabeth II in 2007. His chair of easement, a low oak commode upholstered in faded green velvet, was left standing in the corner of the bedchamber by the attendant who closed the room that night. It has not been moved since. The fire began on the morning of 20th November 1992 in the Queen's private chapel, a small room used by the family for daily prayer. A floodlight intended to assist conservators working on a painting had been left burning too close to a curtain. At 11:15 in the morning, the fabric of the curtain touched the bulb. Within 4 minutes, the curtain was a column of flame reaching the timber ceiling. Within 15 minutes, the fire had spread north along the roof void into St. George's Hall. The state apartments were saved by a sequence of firewall doors closed by the staff of the Royal Collection in the first half hour. The private apartments above the chapel, including bedrooms used by Prince Andrew and his daughters earlier that week, were not. The fire burned through the night. It was extinguished only at 3 in the morning of 21st November, by which time 115 rooms had been lost or damaged and 1.5 million gallons of water had been pumped through the rooms by the Royal Berkshire Fire Brigade. 4 days later, on 24th November 1992, the Queen rose at the Guildhall in the City of London and spoke the line that would title the year. 1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. The restoration was costed at £36.5 million. The Treasury refused to pay. The money was raised instead by opening Buckingham Palace to paying visitors for the first time in its history during the summer months of 1993 and every summer since. The fire that nearly destroyed Windsor is the reason the public can today walk through the throne room at Buckingham Palace in August. Peter Edgecombe was 22 years old in 1810 when he entered service at Windsor as a page of the back stairs. He came from a small holding family in Cornwall, the third son of a tenant farmer on the Mount Edgecombe estate from which he took his name. He stood 5 feet 9 inches and was selected for the post by the equerry Sir Herbert Taylor on the strength of his quietness, his steadiness, and the size of his hands. His hands were large. They were what was wanted. For the next 10 years, it was Peter Edgecombe who buckled the straitjacket on King George III when the fits came on, and Peter Edgecombe who unbuckled it when the king lay quiet. He slept in a truckle bed in the antechamber outside the king's room. He did not marry. He did not leave Windsor for longer than a fortnight in any of those 10 years. On 29th January 1820, the night the king died, Edgecombe was the second person in the room. The first was the Duke of York. Edgecombe washed the body. In the king's will, signed in a moment of lucidity in 1812, there was a single bequest to a member of the household staff. It read, "To my page, Edgecombe, who has shown himself faithful, the sum of £40 to be paid from the privy purse." The £40 was paid in March 1820. Edgecombe used it to buy a small cottage at Datchet, 2 miles east of the castle. He lived there until his death in 1847. He never spoke of what he had done in those 10 years to anyone who left a record. Mary Hesketh was 41 years old in the spring of 1714 when she was appointed bedchamber nurse to Queen Anne in the Queen's apartments at Windsor. She was the widow of a Lancashire apothecary. She had buried 4 children of her own. Queen Anne, by 1714, had carried 17 pregnancies, suffered 12 miscarriages, lost 4 infants in their first year, and watched her only surviving child, Prince William, die at the age of 11 in 1700. The Queen was 49. She was crippled by gout and dropsy. She could no longer walk, unaided. On the morning of 30th of July, 1714, she suffered a stroke in her bedchamber at Kensington, but was moved on the Queen's own insistence to Windsor for what everyone present understood would be her final hours. Mary Hesketh travelled with her. For 2 days and a night, Hesketh sat beside the bed, wiping the Queen's face and moistening her lips with claret on a sponge. At 7:30 on the morning of the 1st August 1714, Queen Anne died. The Hanoverian succession passed that hour to a German cousin who could not speak English. Hesketh closed the Queen's eyes and laid 2 pennies on the lids. She was paid £8 and 12 shillings for the engagement and returned to Lancashire. She does not appear in any subsequent record. Her name survives only in the household accounts of the Privy Purse for August 1714, a single line of brown ink. Walter Knight was 53 years old on the morning of 20th of November 1992, a fire warden of the Royal Household Property Section who had served at Windsor for 28 years. He had begun as a boiler room hand in 1964. When the alarm bell rang at 11:19 on that November morning, Knight was eating a cheese sandwich in the warden's office below the Brunswick Tower. He was the first uniformed responder to reach the private chapel. The room was already a furnace. The altar plate, a silver chalice, 2 flagons, and a salver presented by William IV in 1832 was on the altar at the east end. Knight tied a wet handkerchief over his mouth and walked into the chapel. He lifted the plate. He walked out again. The roof beam over the altar collapsed 11 seconds after he cleared the door. The hair on the back of his head was singed off to the scalp. He set the plate down on the cobbles of the quadrangle and went back in for the altar cross, and was prevented at the second threshold by a wall of flame. In January 1993, Walter Knight was awarded the British Empire Medal in the New Year Honours. The citation read simply, "For services to Windsor Castle on 20th of November 1992. He retired in 1997 and died in 2014. The chalice he saved is still used at family services in the restored private chapel. On 9th of April 2021, in St George's Chapel, below the rooms where her husband had been born 99 years and 10 months earlier in 1921, Queen Elizabeth II sat alone in the choir at the funeral of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. The pandemic had emptied the chapel. 30 mourners were permitted. The Queen sat in black, masked, 4 pews back, the small black figure in a vast cold stone room. 18 months later, on 19th of September 2022, she was carried into the same chapel and laid in the King George VI Memorial Chapel, a small side aisle on the north of the nave, beside her father, beside her mother, beside her sister Margaret, and beside Philip. The royal vault beneath the choir now holds the coffins of 10 monarchs and 25 consorts and royal children. The long walk above stretches 3 miles east from the sovereign's entrance to the Copper Horse on Snow Hill, and every monarch since George III has ridden it at least once. In 2026, King Charles III is in residence at Windsor only at weekends. His weekday business is conducted at Clarence House in London. The state apartments are open to the public most days of the year. The private apartments are not. The door beside the sovereign's entrance remains closed. The chair of easement of George III still stands in the corner of the bedchamber where it was left in January 1820. No one has moved it. No one ever will. Peter Edgecombe buckled the canvas straitjacket on a blind king for the last time on the morning of 29th January 1820, and unbuckled it for the last time the same evening when there was no longer any need. Mary Hesketh laid 2 pennies on the closed eyes of Queen Anne at 7:30 in the morning of 1st August 1714 and walked back to Lancashire and was paid £8 and 12 shillings. Walter Knight carried the silver altar plate of William IV out of a burning chapel at 11:21 on the morning of 20th of November 1992 and went back for the cross and was turned away by the heat. In a private bedchamber on the north front of the upper ward, the chair of easement of King George III, upholstered in green velvet faded to grey, stands in the corner where his page left it in January 1820, and it has not been moved. Subscribe for more deep investigations into the hidden histories of Britain's great castles, palaces, and royal residences. Leave a comment below telling us which place we should investigate next. British Manors, the hidden history of the buildings that shaped England.